The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. On this episode, we look back at an article written in 1995 by Beverly Russell. Today, let's look back at the article, World War II Boomtown, Hastings, and the Naval Ammunition Depot. Jubileum Days, the best outdoor show ever put on in Hastings. In fact, it was the best show of its kind ever put on in Nebraska. Well, so said Hastings resident Lawson Werman about the 1939 community observance in which the community celebrated its heritage. Jubileum Days saw 5,000 people watch the Nebraska Cavalcade Historical Pageant, 1,400 view the dedication of a new museum, and more than 200,000 enjoy one of the biggest parades in Hastings history. The Hastings Police Department managed these huge crowds without any extra assistance, and the only crimes reported were 2 pickpocket incidents. During Jubileum Days, people enjoyed themselves and exulted in their community and its past. 3 years later, in 1942, the proud, harmonious community of Jubileum Days had changed. In the Vox Populi section of the Hastings Daily Tribune, a letter from 2 newcomers to Hastings described hostile citizens and small-town moral squads who were herding newcomers into concentration camps, which they meant government trailer camps. Furthermore, said the writers, they were loyal Americans who were doing their part to win the war. A native of Adams County responded that people of this ilk living in trailer camps were like Hitler because they wanted to force longtime residents from their homes. Finally, in a third letter, another Hastings resident called native a nincompoop. Hastings, which 3 years earlier welcomed 20,000 people in a celebration of its history, had become, by 1942, a community in which residents called each other names in the local newspaper. The establishment of a large defense installation nearby caused this change. The Naval Ammunition Depot forced the relatively insular community of Hastings to accommodate a huge increase in population that brought with it diverse social and ethnic groups and major alterations in lifestyle. Although the city tried to cope, friction developed when Hastings found itself inundated with outsiders. Economic self-interest, unfamiliarity with people of different races and backgrounds, and apprehension about rapid social change shaped community responses. During 1942-43, Hastings, a small rural city proud of its heritage and previously insulated from the outside world, developed several communities within the booming city. Before World War II, population stability and racial homogeneity helped create strong community bonds in Hastings. From its founding in the 1870s until 1940s, the population grew gradually, except for declines during the Depression decades of the 1890s and the 1930s. The racial makeup of Hastings unified residents as well. The native-born white population predominated, while the foreign-born white population gradually decreased. The black population stood at less than 1%, with other races statistically insignificant. The dramatic population increase sparked by the Naval Ammunition Depot changed this small neighborly community into a city bursting at the seams with people. World War II provided communities emerging from the Depression with an opportunity for rapid economic recovery. As war production geared up, Nebraska's senators and congressmen successfully campaigned for the location of several defense plants in Nebraska. Hastings, hard hit by the Great Depression and losing population, reacted enthusiastically to the June 10, 1942 announcement by Senator George Norris and Congressman Carl Curtis that the U.S. Navy would build a $45 million ammunition depot southeast of town. The community recognized the economic boost this facility would provide and the growth potential it offered. Bank deposits provided an indication of the improvement in Hastings' economic health. From December 1941 to December of 1942, bank deposits increased 100% and grew another 45.8% by June 3, 1943. Statewide deposits gained 21.3% for the same period. By 1939, Hastings banks held deposits of only $4.5 million, but by 1944, deposits totaled $12.8 million. The process of purchasing 48,753 acres of land from 232 owners began immediately, and construction on the depot commenced on July 14, 1942. The initial phase of construction extended over 18 months and employed more than 5,000 workers. At its peak capacity in 1945, the depot employed approximately 2,000 military personnel and 6,692 civilian production workers, as well as of about 2,000 civilians still involved in construction. The Naval Ammunition Depot was one of the largest installments of its kind in the United States, eventually covered 75 square miles, and at one time supplied 40% of the Navy's ammunition. Such an enormous project impacted the community immediately. On July 15, 1942, the Hastings Daily Tribune reported 55 new families had arrived in town during the first 2 weeks of July. And by August 11, 1942, the Newcomers Bureau listed more than 300 new families. The Daily Tribune set the population of Hastings at 19,875 in February of 1943, while the 1944 City Directory estimated the 1943 population even higher at 22,252. Depending on which figure is used, population increased either 31 or 47% from the 1940 census. Those figures, compared with the 33% increase in population during the decade of the 1920s, provided some sense of the staggering influx of people. Local residents' responses to these hordes created divisions between them and the newcomers. Hastings tried to ease the absorption of plant workers. In addition to the Newcomers Bureau, which welcomed newcomers to Hastings, civic organizations and churches sponsored programs about issues raised by the influx of workers, as well as providing activities for them. The city established the Hastings Area Emergency Committee to address community needs such as labor shortages and the housing crunch. Women, young and old, volunteered to serve as hostesses at the servicemen's centers and greet troop trains as they traveled through town. Hastings College sponsored dances and a canteen for servicemen. The city government expanded public services to accommodate federal trailer camps and housing areas. The public library extended service to the housing areas, and the Hastings Recreation and Parks Department sponsored a summer recreation program for children. The major effort to accommodate plant workers, however, came from the federal government through its funding of many of the programs and services that the community provided. Some of these included the servicemen's centers, the new elementary school, support of the summer recreation program, and a child care facility for the children of depot workers. It's not surprising that many local people who so recently had endured the Great Depression reacted in their own economic self-interest when the population skyrocketed. The tremendous increase in population created a housing crisis in Hastings. Rents doubled almost overnight, causing an immediate division within the community as depot workers resented being gouged by Hastings landlords. Apartments, which rented for $35 a month prior to the announcement of the depot's coming, increased to $60 and $70 a month, or an increase in some cases of 100%. Stating that 250 new homes needed to be built to accommodate workers, R.M. Thompson, Secretary of the Chamber of Commerce, deplored the unreasonable rent increases and warned that government rent control was a possibility. In time, the War Production Board approved construction of 300 new private homes for occupancy by war workers, which proved to be a boon for local private contractors. Several new housing additions sprang up at various locations in the northern and eastern parts of the city. The problem of rent gougers did not go away, however. Lieutenant Commander W.B. Short, overseer of depot construction, addressed Hastings churches, stating that the enormous rent increases were decidedly not Christian. The situation of school teacher WWII probably represented that of many others. She took an extra job at the depot mail office to compensate for increased rents. Interestingly, Tribune apartment and house rental ads no longer included the rental rates. The Daily Tribune estimated only 5 to 10% of Hastings landlords charged exorbitant rents, but the situation was bad enough that depot employees circulated a flyer, caveat emptor, to warn workers about rent gougers. Obviously, workers resented unreasonably high rents, which contributed to a divisive atmosphere when some Hastings landlords saw depot workers as a group to be exploited. Some Hastings residents formed an anonymous group, the Fair Rents Committee, to try to control exorbitant rents. The committee persuaded 50 landlords to sign a rent control pledge. The Hastings Real Estate Association also endorsed these efforts. Economic self-interest, as well as fair play, influenced these initiatives as a threat of government rent control loomed. Eventually, the Office of Price Administration imposed rent controls in 1943. Not all landlords reacted with avarice to the housing crisis. Many individuals opened their homes to newcomers. Reba Yeakel remembered, quote, "Almost everyone who had a big house made it into apartment living. They would do anything possible to accommodate people," end quote. Lorena Smith, a Hastings housewife, described living in a house with 8 other people, while another couple lived in the backyard chicken house. All shared 2 bathrooms, but the chicken house people used the spigot outside for water. One resident, Ruth Mullen, rented a room in her house to a Mr. Weber, a civilian depot worker. To show his appreciation, Weber brought her rationed coffee and sugar that he acquired at the plant. When Hastings residents became acquainted with plant workers on an individual basis, they often came to regard them as friends, rather than as people to be exploited or resented. Economic self-interest was not always divisive. Business people tried to accommodate the workers, and many merchants began tailoring their newspaper advertisements with the depot and its workers in mind. Additionally, retail stores extended their hours on September 17, 1942, to accommodate construction workers. Banks and professional people followed later. The Powder Keg, a depot newspaper, encouraged plant personnel to take advantage of the extended hours. Apparently, the depot command desired good relations with the business community. Business people also recognized that catering to depot workers would be good for business. Nevertheless, some business people resented the plant workers. Former depot employee Elaine Hatton remembered that some workers felt it was because the depot's pay scale and benefits were better than those available in Hastings. By 1944, the depot offered a base wage of 74 cents an hour for men, the highest allowed by the government, with time and a half for overtime and a 54 to 64-hour work week. Other benefits included accumulated sick and annual leave, low rents through the government housing project, and transportation to the depot. Labor shortages created by the war also proved more severe for local businesses because of the depot's high pay. Finally, in 1944, the War Manpower Commission declared Hastings a Class I labor shortage area, the only city in Nebraska to be so designated. A letter in the Tribune's Vox Populi blamed Hastings' low hand-to-mouth wages for the labor shortage in private industry. This correspondent viewed the Naval Ammunition Depot as a godsend to people with households to support, stating that experienced stenographers, clerks, bookkeepers, and sales clerks received only $16 to $20 per week or 40 to 50 cents an hour from private employers. Depot employees also believed at least some businesses discriminated against them because of where they worked. Many thought they were overcharged if they shopped while wearing their depot badges. Just how pervasive this treatment may have been is unclear. Plant workers perceived unfair treatment, however, which created ill will between them and the local businessmen, further dividing the community. Along with the sudden increase in population came an alteration in the racial makeup of Hastings. Initially, white construction workers arrived in droves. By November of 1942, the construction company imported about 100 Chippewa and Sioux Indians to work the construction site. Then, the Navy announced in December of 1942 that about 400 colored sailors might be sent to the depot, and later announced that black civilian workers would also be employed. For a predominantly white community, this represented a significant change. Racially homogenous Hastings residents unfamiliar with other racial groups became apprehensive. Housing and recreation for African Americans were to become divisive issues. During World War II, racism was casually accepted in America. Schoolteacher Reba Yeakel's comments provided insight into those attitudes of some local residents, with, quote, "With people moving in from everywhere, there was Indians, colored people, and so many kinds of people living there," referring to the trailer camps at the fairgrounds. Then farther south on 11th Street, they moved in 500 units there, which was a better class of people, end quote. Native American, African American, and Mexican children attended Hastings schools. According to Ms. Yeakel, quote, "It was quite a sensation to have these children," end quote. She felt they were accepted because you'll accept most anything during the war. According to Lorena Smith, Hastings was not used to having African Americans around. Many people refused to sit beside them on the bus. Elaine Hatton agreed, quote, "It was something different to see minority people. Their presence was a little uncomfortable for some residents in the community," end quote. Latent racism in Hastings caused residents to assume that different racial groups needed separate housing and separate recreational facilities. A newspaper article announcing the arrival of the first group of Sioux workers from the Rosebud Reservation referred to them as braves and described them as being on the warpath. Its heedless, condescending tone is apparent. This group of Sioux lived at the plant in tents. Apparently, the depot provided no recreational facilities for them. Reba Yeakel recalled that Indians lingered around the lobby of the post office building, whereas a, quote, "federal people, they felt safe," end quote. Perhaps the Sioux preferred to live in camps as a separate community. However, the end result was the same. The Sioux as a group were disconnected from the larger white community in Hastings. Racial prejudice became more apparent when the Navy announced that black sailors and civilians would serve at the depot. Issues of housing and recreation for African Americans aroused concern among white Hastings residents. In December 1942, the City Council discussed recreation for black sailors. Navy Representative Lieutenant Commander J.C. Heck, who had previously been stationed with black sailors at Fallbrook, California, assured the council that in California, quote, "businessmen commented on the good behavior of the men," end quote, and that his experience and observation is that colored troops have been well behaved. During the discussion of recreational facilities, council members asserted that they preferred white troops. However, they acknowledged the need for a separate recreation center for the Negroes if they came. Unlike the city of Kearney, Hastings welcomed the opening of a separate center for African American servicemen, although the council preferred that no tavern be associated to it. To Hastings residents, the most important issue was that the center remained separate from the one for white servicemen. Although no action was taken at the time, eventually the city, with the aid of a federal grant, opened a separate center for black servicemen at 624 West 1st Street, which regularly scheduled activities and dances. As time passed, this area along 1st Street gained a reputation for rowdiness as it catered exclusively to African Americans with both legal and illegal businesses. Before the center opened, recreation created a problem for African Americans in Hastings. Elaine Hatton remembered that there was not much for, quote, "colored people," end quote, to do with their time off. Every Friday afternoon, depot officials provided cattle trucks with benches on the side, usually used to transport workers, to take black workers to Omaha, where there was a sizable African American community. Hastings' assumption that separate facilities were a necessity forced African Americans to travel for hours in converted cattle trucks in search of entertainment. Housing for blacks in Hastings also created considerable controversy among residents. Following the announcement that Negro civilians would work the plant, a delegation of 30 homeowners from Northwest Hastings approached the city council in an unsuccessful attempt to oppose the housing of blacks in the Pleasant Hills trailer camp, also in Northwest Hastings. According to a spokesman for the group, quote, Negro people are proud of their color. They, too, want their own communities, their own schools, their own recreation. We're proud of them and their leaders in the contributions that they are making in the war effort. They, too, are faced with problems, being uprooted from their established homes. It would be best if they could be given a community of their own, end quote. Perhaps this was true. However, it is doubtful if anyone asked the black families. The delegation assumed that, quote, Negroes wanted segregation. The city council voted unanimously to oppose the housing of African Americans in the government trailer camps, even though the city could take no binding action. The delegation then signed a petition stating their opposition to, quote, Negro housing, end quote, on the trailer camp. Despite these objections, both African Americans and Native Americans ultimately resided at the camp. The federal government also provided housing for black civilian workers in the Spencer Park Addition, located in southeastern Hastings. Although the project was not completed until 1944, just the announcement that blacks would reside in Spencer Park caused consternation among South Hastings residents. In November 1943, a Southside resident wrote the Vox Populi column deriding, quote, Northsiders for their fuss over Negroes living in the trailer camps. Are they afraid that they will get a taste of what the Southside is going to get? End quote. The Southside resident further asserted that, quote, we Southsiders don't care about housing Negroes either, end quote. When Spencer Park was completed in 1944, black families lived in 260 buildings in the southeastern section farthest away from Hastings. A separate recreation building was also built, and the black families organized a separate governing council. Hastings, a community with limited experience in race relations, now had segregated housing. Not surprisingly, the segregated Navy provided segregated on-base housing as well. About 60 colored families resided in Prairie Village, remodeled construction workers' barracks built because, quote, wives and families of Negro enlisted men on the depot were having difficulty finding homes in town, end quote. Like Spencer Park, Prairie Village included a separate recreation hall for the black families. On base and off, segregated housing and recreation for African Americans was the norm. While blacks and Indians found themselves completely separated from the community, white civilian workers who lived in trailer camps also came to be viewed apprehensively as a distinct group by local residents. In response to the housing emergency created by the depot, the federal government constructed a trailer camp. Pleasant Hills, built at the fairgrounds in northwest Hastings, contained 250 trailers originally, later expanded to about 800. An additional facility built later along 11th Street eventually accommodated 500 trailers. The Pleasant Hills camp included toilet, shower, and laundry facilities, as well as a recreation center. However, overcrowding and poor sanitation, dust and mud from the unpaved roads, and rowdy behavior often caused difficulties. Some trailer dwellers resented the condition of the camps, and local residents frequently viewed the trailer dwellers and camps harshly. To escape the congested and unsanitary trailer camps, some people began parking trailers on private yards rather than at the camps. Undoubtedly, this was a more pleasant arrangement for these people, with the added advantage of feeling more a part of the community. After complaints from local residents, however, the city council voted for strict enforcement of the trailer park ordinances requiring homeowners to purchase a permit and to provide adequate toilet and shower facilities for both sexes within 200 feet of the trailers. This, in effect, forced the trailer dwellers back into the camps and kept them separated from the larger community. A series of letters in the Vox Populi section of the Daily Tribune provides an insight into community attitudes, clearly indicating the dissension between locals and trailer people. Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Henderson, trailer dwellers, wrote to advise, quote, hostile citizens, end quote, that, quote, we don't choose to be herded into concentration camps where our morals, health, and social welfare shall be dictated by small-town morals squads. We are good American citizens helping to win this war. Some of us are mothers of boys in this war somewhere, fighting to make the world safe for this same group who are trying to herd these mothers into camps, end quote. Other letters from trailer dwellers expressed similar feelings. A native of Adams County responded angrily to Henderson's letter. This person wanted to know, quote, Why are they living in trailer camps, drifting from place to place, especially if they have been successful before the war? Did they ever have a home to leave? If they did, I'm sure it wasn't to do their bit toward the war that they left, as they say. It was more to get big pay at the plant. We at Hastings didn't ask for them to quit their jobs to come here to work on the defense plant, end quote. The letter closed by stating, quote, some of these campers are like Hitler and want us to move out for them, end quote. Obviously, the native resented the changes taking place in Hastings and blamed the newcomers, whom she did not view as individuals but as a faceless group. Plainly, the native wished these outsiders would return from whence they came. Finally, Hastings resident Helen Bazar defended the Hendersons and answered, that nincompoop who hasn't the nerve to sign her name. She pointed out that if the native took the time to get to know these people, she would realize that her assumptions were wrong. What was it about white trailer dwellers that caused them to be viewed almost like a separate racial group by some Hastings residents? Perhaps guilt by association created this situation. These people lived in camps, especially Pleasant Hills, that also housed many African Americans and Native Americans. Furthermore, trailers represented temporary, transient dwellings, and some people viewed trailer occupants as transients also. The native author certainly saw them as drifting from place to place, according to her letter. Although many plant workers were from the local area, including displaced farmers, many others came from across the United States, with a sizable group from Nebraska and the Midwest. Missouri, however, represented home to scores of new depot workers. Because so many workers came from Missouri, some local residents may have stereotyped them as backward hillbillies and therefore unwelcome. Helen Bazar appeared to have the key to acceptance of the newcomers. If locals took time to become acquainted with them, they discover that their trailer dwellers were good people too. The Adams County native, seemingly unacquainted with the trailer dwellers, made judgments based upon her preconceived ideas, prejudices, and apprehensions. Individuals like Helen Bazar, who knew the Hendersons or the other trailer people, judged them on their own merits. Unfortunately, while some trailer people may have found individual acceptance, others felt excluded, a separate community. Although the Naval Ammunition Depot provided an economic boost for the community, Hastings residents faced other alterations in their way of life. Congestion extended everywhere, and waiting in line became commonplace. Overcrowded schools, heavy traffic, and crime were public concerns. Parking became an acute problem in downtown Hastings, and the Chamber of Commerce asked the police department to correct it. Residents reacted with apprehension and anxiety to these changes as well. Overcrowding in the schools created a strain on teachers and resources. The 1942 school year began with 235 more students in the public schools than in 1941. By August 1943, the Daily Tribune reported a 1943-44 all-school enrollment of 4,359 students, 47% more than in 1941-42. Elementary teacher Reba Yeakel remembered teaching 57 children, compared with 20 to 25 students normally. The large enrollments forced schools to extend the school day and to hire extra teachers, creating a financial burden on some of the schools. Eventually, the new elementary school was constructed in Spencer Park, the government housing project. Traffic was not the only law enforcement problem facing the community. After several reports of women and children being accosted and molested, the city hired an extra policeman, purchased two-way radios for the patrol cars, and instituted a curfew for children under 16. Residents' concerns centered both on the safety of women and children as well as on the rising incidence of juvenile delinquency. Additionally, citizens formed a vigilante committee to work with the police department to improve law enforcement. Reba Yeakel recalled, quote, "Being a single woman, I wouldn't walk around late at night," end quote. During Jubileum days in 1939, Hastings police had controlled crowds in excess of 20,000 people with almost no problems. In 1942, concerns about crime led to the formation of a vigilante committee. Crime and congestion caused local residents to be apprehensive about the sudden changes taking place in their community. No longer did women feel safe walking alone at night. New people arrived and rents skyrocketed. Local residents, unfamiliar with people of differing races or lifestyles, often reacted in their economic self-interest or with apprehension. The Naval Ammunition Depot remained in operation until 1966. Except for a spurt during the Korean War, production and personnel never again approached World War II levels. The Pleasant Hills trailer camp closed, but Spencer Park remained open and evolved into a Good Samaritan Village retirement complex. The depot site became home to Central Community College, the Roman L. Hruska U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, and Hastings Industrial Park East, housing 40 different firms. A more troubling legacy to the Hastings area was soil and groundwater contamination from the depot. The cleanup process will continue into the future. Historian Gerald Nash argues that World War II transformed the American West. Had the war transformed Hastings? In the short term, it is apparent that life changed significantly, and those changes caused reactions which divided the community. In the long term, however, change was not as dramatic. Peace brought a cutback of depot production and personnel. Indian workers returned to their reservations. Black sailors and civilians also left. The racial makeup of the community returned to pre-war ratios. By 1950, the population stood at 20,221. A significant increase from the 15,145 of 1940, but down considerably from the 22,252 reported in 1943, and proportionally in line with increases throughout the decades of the 20th century. While war industry helped Hastings recover from the ravages of the Great Depression and provided a basis for growth in the future, Hastings attracted no major post-war industrial development such as the defense and aircraft industries on the West Coast. World War II dramatically impacted Hastings, Nebraska, but it did not transform the community. In many ways, Hastings returned to what it had been before the war, a rural, racially homogeneous city economically dependent on agriculture. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about the Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.